This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Connecticut author and lawyer Anne Howard is known for her work writing true crime, but her recent book is a departure from that genre. Today, we talk about her new book that she helped translated. It's called Escape from Mariupol, a survivor's true story. Anne first met Adoriana Marek, a pseudonym, through mutual friends. They exchanged letters, and Adoriana sent her hand-drawn cards and other artwork over the years. When the war broke out, Anne was desperate to contact Adoriana to know that she was safe. What followed was a month-long exchange and a collaborative effort to write a book about Adoriana's experience. She has since settled in Connecticut as a refugee, but she continues to heal from the many atrocities that she witnessed. And because she suffers from PTSD, she won't be joining us this hour. But here to tell us about her story and their friendship is Anne Howard. Anne, welcome to Where We Live.
Thank you so much for having me.
And please feel free to join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And can you first share with us, how did you come to know Adoriana?
Yes, of course. It was almost 25 years ago when I was looking for a nanny to take care of my two young children while I built a busy law practice. And I thought it would be good to find a Ukrainian nanny so that our kids could learn about another culture. And I contacted a woman online named Ina Marik, who lived in Mariupol. Unfortunately, we couldn't get her a work visa. And so we ended up hiring a Polish nanny. But I stayed in touch with Ina on a monthly basis over the decades, and often her little sister, Adoriana, who was only 10 years old at the time, would write little notes and draw me little pictures. So that's our background. Ina eventually moved to America to marry an American, and Adoriana remained behind in Mariupol.
And tell us a little bit about Adoriana's background and her life in Ukraine before the war. She was a tattoo artist, and she also loved animals.
Yes, she is very talented as an artist. She paints, she's a photographer, she draws tattoos. She really has a great eye. And she talks about how she got that from her mother. Her mother was also an artist and painted murals in the communist days in Ukraine. But before the war, Adoriana had a really full and peaceful life. She lived in a 3-bedroom apartment in downtown Mariupol. She had her beloved husky dog, a Siberian husky named Yola, that she would take for long walks when she didn't have to work. She would go to street festivals and ethnic restaurants. Mariupol, before the war began on February 24th of 2022, was really a happening place. You know, there was a lot to do all of the time, and it really had that kind of European ambiance to it that wasn't there when she was born in 1990. At the time, communism was, the controlling factor. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, Mariupol became a beautiful democratic city.
Well, and thank you for painting that picture. I think oftentimes we forget what life was like prior to such a catastrophic event, and we'll certainly dig into that in a little bit. But I do want to ask, where was Adoriana when the war broke out? The way it was described in the book made it seem like possible war was looming, but life was as usual. It was still happening. What was that like?
Yeah, well, if you can see it in the context that the people of Ukraine were constantly aware for years and years of the threat that Russia posed. Whether it was in the Orange Revolution, where they protested Russian interference with the elections, or the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and 15. So the people of Mariupol were aware of course, the troops that were surrounding Ukraine. And they knew that something could happen at any minute, but they really had no choice but to just carry on with their lives. And that's what she was doing. She went to bed on the night of February 23rd and awoke just before dawn to the sound of bombs dropping. I describe it as sort of an apocalyptic scenario where She doesn't know what to do. She calls her friend. She runs to her friend's apartment, and the streets are full of cars. There's a jam-packed traffic jam leading out to the exit that leads out to the city. So everybody was trying to flee when the first bombs dropped. Unfortunately, Adoriana didn't have a car like most residents of Mariupol. She did not drive. She relied on public transportation. So she was really stuck in the city. She did manage a couple days after the start of the invasion to get a train ticket to take her out of Mariupol. But on that day, the Russians bombed the train tracks. So then she was really trapped, and she had to figure out how she would survive.
And when I read that portion, it was really sort of mind-boggling because it reads as something that's very unreal, but it's clearly very real. Can you talk to us about, what were the early days in the war like for her when she found the bomb shelter? Because she spent quite a bit of time there.
Yeah, she and her two friends actually went to the underground basement of the building where her friends lived, this 14-story building. And they hid under there alongside over 200 other civilians, mostly women and children, although there were men in that shelter as well who kept order. And it was dreadful, really. It was the middle of winter, so it's February and March in Mariupol. There was no heat in that basement, so they were freezing cold. There was very little water. In order to drink, they had to get the droplets from the boiler pipes. And some of the people went up to melt dirty snow and drink that snow. But that was dangerous because the bombs were constantly dropping, especially at night. And there was relentless gunfighting in the streets. So the people down below in that shelter were suffering greatly. They went for days without food and water. And everybody was sick, including Adoriana. At that time, only 40% of Ukrainians were vaccinated for COVID. And it was a very peak period for the spread of COVID in Mariupol. So she speculates that she was probably sick along with everyone else in that shelter with COVID or something else. And most importantly, during those 5 weeks that she spent underground, the neighboring buildings were being bombed, and residents from those buildings would flee into the basement, often with life-threatening injuries. And so, fortunately, Adoriana took a sort of like a Red Cross course, a paramedic course before the war. And those skills and that instruction really came in handy because on one night in particular, she had to save a man who had shattered his foot and put a tourniquet around his leg. And there were many people from those neighboring buildings that had head traumas and amputated limbs. And unfortunately, many of them died in the basement. And the occupants of the basement, they could not take the bodies up to bury them because it was just too dangerous in the streets. So these people literally slept beside corpses during that time. It was also a very filthy environment because there was no toilet. So they were instructed by the leaders of the shelter to, do whatever they had to do in corners of the shelter. And keep in mind, too, that people had their pets. They had their cats and dogs in that shelter. So it was really an awful smelling place.
Well, I can't imagine having survived through that and still having the power and courage to tell her story. And in wartime, I think we like to think that people will rally together, but sometimes these conditions actually bring out the worst in people. And she describes in the book that some people couldn't take what was happening around her and were drinking heavily and behaving inappropriately. What can you share about that with us?
Yeah, right. The stress level in that basement was off the charts because every time the bombs fell, the building would shake and they wouldn't know if it would fall down on them. So there was just constantly moaning and groaning and crying. In one instance, a drunk man in the shelter, an older man, attempted to sexually assault Adoriana when no one was around looking. And she had to fend him off with a knife that she had with her in the shelter. And then it was the leaders of that shelter, the men that she calls the heroes or the angels, she refers to them as angels. They came over and came to her rescue and led the man away. So again, they kept order in the shelter so that ugly element could not take over and injure more people.
Well, order is important when you're in such a chaotic situation. And you mentioned a lot of people having their pets around, and we know pets provide such emotional support during any time. Can you talk about Adoriana throughout this journey? She was adamant of bringing her husky, Yola, with her. How do you think Yola was able to support Adoriana throughout this time?
I think it's fair to say that Adoriana probably would not have survived without this dog. She had this dog, she had her strapped to a leash around her waist so that at all times she was attached to her dog and her dog couldn't run off and risk dying in the war. And Yola really gave Adoriana a reason to live because, some people have their spouses or their children or their parents. As a single 31-year-old woman, Adoriana was completely alone in this world. And so she so heavily relied on this dog. Just petting the dog and talking to the dog while the bombs and the fighting were going on, I think gave her tremendous comfort. And on one occasion, the dog literally saved her life when the auto parts store above the basement was bombed and caught fire, and all of the noxious chemicals and fumes came into the basement, and the people were choking and had no choice but to escape the shelter in the middle of the night when the streets were being bombed very heavily and Russian soldiers were in the streets. So Adoriana fled to the street with her dog around her waist, and the Russian soldiers started shooting at the civilians. Even though they knew that there were over 200 civilians in that shelter, they didn't seem to care. And they just shot at all the civilians, including Adoriana. And she fell to the ground. And in her words, she said goodbye to life. And it was Yola, her dog, that leapt up and pulled Adoriana to her feet and went full steam ahead back into the shelter. And in that way, if the dog had not done that, I think she would have died on that night.
Well, I think we were already feeling the goosebumps earlier. I think that story just turned our entire team into a puddle of tears. And I mean, what a terrible story, right? But also what a beautiful story between Adoriana and Yola. And I want to also mention that Adoriana's parents also came up a bit in the book. They lived under Soviet control, and Adoriana had mentioned that they didn't understand the war the way she did. Can you help us break that down, to help us understand what that sort of philosophy and thought process was like for Adoriana?
Sure. I mean, she still struggles with that frustration to this day that her parents don't seem to understand what is going on. They live in Russian occupied territory in eastern Ukraine. And when you think about it, she was born in 1990, Adoriana. And in 1991, the USSR fell and Ukraine became a sovereign democracy. So Adoriana has known nothing but democracy all of her life. And she has really embraced that Ukrainian identity of, just wanting to think for yourself, wanting to do what you want to do when you want to do it, and not being controlled by an autocratic government. But in contrast, her parents, for all of their childhoods, respectively, and their adulthood, up until 1990, lived under communism. So I think that created an incredibly different mindset in them that Adoriana cannot relate to or understand. where they don't fight back. Right now, they just want negotiations, and they want it all to go away, and they seem to be minimizing, the horror of what's happened, and I think it hurts her that they don't want to know about what she went through in Mariupol. They would rather say, "How's the weather?" Literally, "How's the weather?" Not, "Oh my God, dear girl, what have you been through? Tell us everything." It's not like that, and there's probably also a fear factor that they are afraid of making trouble, of getting in trouble, and so they are silent on many issues, and I think that makes her feel very alone.
Well, and I think that is such a complicated subject, right? There's history, there's context, and I mean that's a whole show in of itself. And but I wonder the struggles too with Adoriana. Not only is she trying to figure this out with her parents, which is a generational gap, but she's
Mm-hmm.
also dealing with that with her peers, with her friends. And as if
Mm-hmm.
this is not already a heartbreaking story, but one of the most heartbreaking parts of the book was the friendships that was ruptured by the war. And you have mentioned earlier a little bit too, like for a time she was traveling with friends, Luda and Ivan. Can you talk about that experience and how their friendship ended when she decided to try to leave the city and the country?
Right. We think in America, how often politics can tear apart a relationship, no matter how close that relationship is. And she was very close to this couple in the basement. They stuck together. And when they were evacuated out of Mariupol and taken to Russian occupied territory, she assumed that Luda and Ivan were 100% pro Ukrainian, especially after all that they had witnessed. Luda and Ivan had witnessed everything Adoriana had witnessed. They witnessed the cruel deaths of women and children. They witnessed the massacre of people. They walked through the carnage. When they left the basement and went to the hospital, they saw the dismembered limbs, the human corpses everywhere, the graves marked with crosses that the Russian occupiers were known to pull from the ground. So they saw everything she did, but when it came time to make the decision of whether or not to go to Russia, because they were given the choice, you can either go to Russia or you can stay in Russian occupied territory. Adoriana refused to go to Russia, and her friends really lambasted her, saying, how can you turn down the Russians' generous offer? It's God's will that Russia wins this war. Russia is stronger than Ukraine, so you must submit. And I think she felt that level of betrayal by these friends, that she felt like she never even knew them, that they were putting their self-interest and their need for immediate comfort ahead of the fight for Ukraine. And when they left her on that bus to go to Russia and risk going to a filtration camp, she just broke down sobbing. And thank God there was a woman there in the town of Nikolsk who, took her into her house and took care of her for a few days.
So she was able to at least have some experience some kindness during that very, I mean, it's so dramatic and so intense, but so real. And do you know, since then, has she heard from them at all?
She did hear from the man of this couple a few months ago, and he went to Sweden, I believe. He went to Russia. They went to Russia and somehow were able to travel and go as Ukrainian refugees to Sweden. So they did get lucky. But, Adoriana is very suspicious of people and very distrusting after all she's been through. But, even one day I had someone in the house doing some repairs, and we were talking about the war. And, like most Americans, he was expressing his distress about what was happening over there. And when he left, Adoriana said to me, you should not trust that man. People say things, but they don't mean them. And for all you know, he could be pro-Russian and he's keeping it from you. And but what she didn't understand is we really don't have that same dynamic here in the United States. We're not afraid of Putin and Russia. So I think that really left a mark on her.
Right. And I can't possibly imagine that kind of culture shock. And we'll be continuing this conversation. You've been listening to Anne Howard. She's a Connecticut author and lawyer working with Adoriana Marek, who escaped the war in Ukraine, to help tell her story about how she made it to the United States. More on the book, Escape from Mariupol, a survivor's true story, when we come back from a short break. Please feel free to join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We're back with Connecticut author and lawyer Anne Howard. She's been sharing her experience working with Adoriana Marek, who escaped the war in Ukraine. They wrote a book together about her experiences. And in the last segment, we learned about the very harrowing and unimaginable situations that Adoriana found herself in, and she was somehow able to escape the war-torn country. And I think her story really reemphasizes that the headlines we see are so much more than just headlines, that there are real human beings behind the stories. And so, Anne, can you describe what her journey looked like leaving Ukraine, from experiencing Russian checkpoints and also the kindness of strangers? This was definitely an indescribable experience where every decision she made had an impact on her journey.
Absolutely, yes. When she left Mariupol, she describes a fear that she had getting into that bus, which was, being supervised by Russian soldiers with, machine guns, getting the people onto this bus. So she felt such a sense of powerlessness and fear because she had no idea where the bus was going to be taking them. And after all, she did just witness everything that Russia had done in Mariupol. So it was terrifying. They took her to a town in Russian occupied territory. And from there, she stayed in that town with a kind woman who, allowed her to bathe. Keep in mind, she was underground for 5 weeks. So she had not brushed her teeth. She had not combed her hair or showered. So this kind woman, gave her a change of clothes and fed her and gave her medicine. She stayed there for 3 days. The woman wanted her to stay forever, to marry a man in that town. And she chose wisely to escape Nikolsk in the middle of the night, just before dawn, and get into a car with a stranger who would then drive her to Berdyansk. So that in itself was very risky. We've heard a lot about the human trafficking that's going on in Ukraine. And throughout this journey, every time she would go into a stranger's car and pay them money to take her somewhere, she had no idea if this stranger had her best interests in mind or would rob her or, throw her to the side of the road. So even that was terrifying. From Berdyansk, she managed to get a drive to Zaporizhia. And it's in Zaporizhia, well, actually, the Russian, excuse me, I'm getting a little messed up in my timeline here. From Berdyansk, she took the buses, the Red Cross buses, to Zaporizhia. But at every step of the way, there was the threat that the buses would not arrive, that the person driving her could cause her injury, that she could be stopped at a Russian checkpoint and detained. And there were so many checkpoints that for, a 3-hour journey before the war would end up taking 12 hours now because of the numerous checkpoints in which at that time they would be asked to show their arms and legs, and prove that they had no tattoos indicating support of Ukraine. Um, in a crazy way, they would check for neo-Nazi symbols, swastikas, and other Nazi symbols on the Ukrainians' bodies, because the Russian propaganda had, led these soldiers to believe that this was a war against Nazis. So yes, it was extremely stressful to travel across Ukraine to free Ukraine. And it was when she finally got to Venezia that it was smooth sailing. Then she was able to quickly get to Poland. And from Poland, she went to the Czech Republic and lived in a refugee hostel.
We've been talking a lot about her fairly negative experience, if I can say, of trying to escape from a war-torn area. But can you tell us also, about the relationships that she's been able to develop on this journey?
Right. Well, she often says in the book, which, by the way, she wrote emails to me just a month after she left that shelter. We started a collaborative effort of exchanging emails, and she would write to me about the angels and the devils that she would encounter along her way. The woman she stayed with in Nikolsk was just a beautiful angel, and her soldier friends who met her in Venezia. They offered their home to her and let her stay there for a few days. So there were many people along the way that would be generous with her and care for her. And it kind of had a way of reassuring her that humanity is basically good, despite the level of evil going on around her, that it was the love of certain human beings and the compassion that restored her faith in humanity.
And she's had opportunities to go to other countries, but Adoriana received an invitation to come to the United States. Can you describe, how she came to that decision and what that final leg of her journey looked like?
Sure. Well, when she was at the refugee hostel in the Czech Republic, she was looking for a job, and she didn't speak the language. So any jobs available were kind of really low paying menial labor jobs that would trap her in a cycle of poverty, where she would work long days and live in a tiny little dirty apartment kind of thing. So she started to think, well, where do I go from here? And she considered the Netherlands. However, she read that a lot of the refugee hostels in the Netherlands did not allow animals. So there was no way she was leaving Yola behind. She had to go somewhere where she could take her dog. Also, so many of these European countries have been maxed out, in terms of the goodwill and the money that they can offer to refugees. So as we all know, the cost of living in most of these countries in Europe is very high. And, not speaking the language is a great obstacle in trying to find a job and a place to live. So it was with that in mind that she decided to come to Connecticut, where my husband and I would welcome her into our house through the Uniting for Ukraine program. And, she is learning English. She takes classes 3 times a week. And, she's just doing great. She's learning to drive. So I think what it came down to is that in America, she was given a lot more opportunities that she wouldn't have had in Europe. And also she was given the support, the daily support. My husband and I are, constantly trying to help her with things. And if she were a refugee alone in the Netherlands right now, I think it would have been just too stressful after all she's been through, to be alone in a strange country without people that can help you along the way.
Well, I think we are all very happy here that she did not have to leave Yola behind and that she has found such a loving home. I want to ask, what was that first day like when you picked her up from the airport? What was going through your mind?
Well, we waited for a long time at LaGuardia in New York City, and they let the Ukrainians off the plane. She took the plane from Warsaw, Poland, directly to JFK. And the Ukrainians that came off the plane at the end after they went through customs, you could just feel the stress of all of these people, all of whom were refugees coming off the plane, that they just came from something extremely difficult. There was a lot of crying. And with Adoriana, when she came off the plane, I expected just to give her a big hug and welcome her. And I expected it to be a happy occasion. But when she came off the plane, I went to embrace her, and she pushed me away and turned her head and broke down sobbing. She says now that she just felt embarrassed and just overwhelmed, that she was in America. Traveling over the ocean made her realize just how far away she was going, not only from Ukraine, but from her parents. And so, yeah, that took me by surprise. I realized, wow, she's very fragile, and she's going to need a lot of love and rest.
Well, and I was going to say, you're no stranger to PTSD because of your law practice. You represented a lot of clients who have suffered from trauma, but you have said that you've never met someone who experienced the same level of relentless, life-threatening trauma as Adoriana. So in the book, she talks about her insomnia and other parts of her trauma. So what does her life look like now that she's in Connecticut, and how is she processing what she has been through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just can't believe how well she's doing after all that she has been through. I thought it would be a good idea if she received counseling from a Russian-speaking counselor. So she speaks to this man on a weekly basis in Connecticut, and I think that helps. I think also what has helped her so much is just the kindness of so many people that we come across in our day-to-day interactions. She just that love and support is very healing for her. But yes, when I represented vets who were claiming PTSD as a disability, we almost always won the case because of the severity of their PTSD. And when I look back on the stories, they would tell me about what the source of their PTSD was, and then compare it to Adoriana's experience. I think the main difference was that the vets would have a one-time experience. So they saw something horrible, or, it was one violent, traumatizing experience that left them with PTSD. Whereas in Adoriana's case, every day involved witnessing death. Every day involved being afraid that you were going to get shot, or just the sound of the bombs day after day. And, like I said, sleeping beside corpses. I've never seen that level of trauma in anyone until now.
And I think it's really amazing that at the end of the day, she believes that humanity is basically good. And I do want to ask as well, how did you all determine that you wanted to do a book? I know you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of emailing going on right after she got out of the shelter. And is that sort of where that seed was planted? Tell us about that process.
Yeah. Well, when I called her sister in Florida, Ina, and after the start of the invasion, for 5 weeks, we had no idea where Adoriana was. So we were so relieved and happy when we found out that she had gotten out and she was in Poland on her way to the Czech Republic. So yeah, bring me back to the question.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, what
Yes,
inspired you to start this book?
Of course, just talking about it makes me tired.
Yeah, no,
so
definitely.
I emailed her when she was in the Czech Republic, and I just did it because I knew that she needed comfort and guidance. And I asked her what had happened, and she just proceeded to unload on me, everything that happened to her in these, multi-page emails, which I translated the Russian into English, just using my Gmail. And I thought, this is a story that just demands to be shared publicly, and people need to know this, because Unlike Bucha or other places in Ukraine, Western journalists can't go into Mariupol. And so, with the exception of drone footage, we have no idea what happened in Mariupol. And I just felt it was so important to have an eyewitness account, because even now we see, people who are trying to brush it under the rug and minimize what happened. And there's nothing more powerful than an eyewitness account of what really happened. So I did ask her, would you mind? Could we write a book about it? And to my surprise, she said, yes, of course. And, we started the book at the end of April 2022. And that was just a couple months, 1 month after she left the basement. So all of these memories were so fresh, which was also a big plus, because she remembered every single detail of what she experienced and how things made her feel. And, she has told me that now that she has written it all down and I have shared it, she really doesn't want to talk publicly about it because it's just traumatic, and she ends up having panic attacks when she talks to people about it. So it was actually kind of therapeutic for her to get it all out of her system. And we finished the book at the end of September. So it was basically 5 months that we focused on writing that book.
Well, I think words can't really describe from us how grateful we are that both of you are willing to share her story, and absolutely agree that it's such an important one to tell. We got a couple of minutes here, but I do want to ask, in the book, Adoriana says, I am simply one woman with a story to share with those who are willing to listen. What are you hoping readers and listeners take away from this book and from our conversation today?
Yeah, I think that's really important to understand that she is not a political person. She has never been a political person. She states that, she was notably apolitical in Ukraine. So this is a story of a human being, regardless of politics, of what you believe, who's right, who's wrong. This is a story of what she experienced at the hands of an autocratic dictator, leading a vicious war to just wipe out the identity of a democratic nation. And I believe that what she went through, so many other people went through in Ukraine and continue to go through to this day. And I think there is real power in telling a true story about what is really going on in Ukraine right now. I hope people feel inspired. I do. I hope they feel like they want to support Ukraine even more. I hope they feel grateful if they're American or Canadian. I hope they feel grateful to live in the democracy that they live in, because, it's not until you read a story like this that you realize how lucky you are to live in a free country and to not have a foreign government threaten your life. So I hope people are inspired, and also I hope it causes people to realize what a gift democracy is, and that we need to do everything we can to preserve our democracies, regardless of what country it's in. Democracy is not a right. It's something that's a privilege that you have to fight to protect.
Well, I think that's a beautiful message to start and end the day, really. You've been hearing from Anne Howard. She's a Connecticut author and lawyer who's translated Adoriana Marik's story from Russian to English. Adoriana was able to escape the war in Ukraine and worked with Anne to tell her story. If you want to see some of Adoriana's incredible artwork or find more information about the book, you can visit our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Anne will be staying with us. Coming up next, we're joined by a University of Massachusetts professor who's been working on supporting Ukraine's literary community. You can also join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We've been hearing from Anne Howard. She's a Connecticut author and lawyer who worked with Adoriana Marek to tell her story of escaping the war in Ukraine. Her story is just one of many coming out of Ukraine. And here to tell us about efforts to document the war and prevent stories from getting lost is Askold Melnyczuk. He's an English professor at the University of Massachusetts and an author himself. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for having me. And thanks, Anne, for your incredible work on this book with Adoriana. It sounds really astonishing. I have already ordered it and can't wait to read it.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you.
Well, that is a beautiful start. I want to ask Asko, what are you hearing from Ukrainian American writers and writers in Ukraine? What projects are you working on now?
Yeah, thanks. I'm hearing a lot, and I haven't stopped hearing since I began listening when the war began. I'm hearing both that there is a sense of fatigue, and at the same time there is a sense of determination and absolute refusal to surrender an inch of territory, either actual territory or sort of internal territory. The writers I'm in touch with are determined to stick it out and to triumph. I mean, it's really kind of a remarkable experience to listen and connect directly with some of the writers who are often on the front themselves.
And we spent so much time over the last hour talking about how powerful, Adoriana's story is, especially for those who are, unfamiliar with what's happening. And so the power of words, I think we can all appreciate, is really important when we're telling stories. So you're a part of a collective of writers and booksellers called Helping Ukrainian Books and Booksellers, or HUB. Can you tell us about this effort and where our listeners can find out more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Catherine. So about 6 months ago, my friend Mitchell Kaplan, who runs a fabulous bookstore in Miami called Books and Books. Mitch is really kind of a major intellectual presence in Florida itself. And he has a podcast, and he had asked me to invite 2 Ukrainian writers to join him for a conversation. Those 2 writers were Marianna Savka and Victoria Amelina. Marianna is a poet, a performer, and also a publisher and bookseller. And Victoria Amelina is herself a novelist. And both their stories are indicative. In one case, Victoria Amelina, whom I met when she was living with her family here in Brookline, Massachusetts, she again is a novelist, a mother of 2. Victoria is now back in Ukraine, and what she is doing is documenting women, documenting war crimes. So that's an example of how radically the war has changed and upended individual lives. Marianna Savka, who spent some time living in the States about a decade ago, has become one of Ukraine's leading publishers. She's the editor and publisher of a press called Old Lion Books. And she told Mitch about the damage that was being done to the Ukrainian book and publishing industry. Some 3,000 libraries and bookstores have been destroyed in the war zone areas. And in part, so much of Ukrainian publishing is located in the eastern part of the country around Kharkiv. Book warehouses, bookstores, publishing enterprises have been bombed. We learned from her, and then through her, from the head of the Ukrainian Publishers and Booksellers Association, Alexander Aponin, that some 3,000 publishing and bookselling professionals had lost their livelihoods. They were being supported by very meager stipends offered by the government, since most of the country's money is going to support the war effort. Suddenly, these people who had families to support, who had regular jobs, found themselves living with friends, going back to villages to live with families, and really having no means of support. So Mitchell, the writer Carolyn Forche, the poet and memoirist Christopher Merrill from the University of Iowa, and Jane Unruh, who runs Harvard's Scholars and Artists at Risk program, formed this group called HUB. And what we've been doing is fundraising to support, to really just to raise money to support unemployed booksellers and publishing professionals. We sent the first sort of grant of $10,000 over to Alexander Afonin at the Ukrainian organization, and those 10,000 have been spread among some 60 unemployed workers who are each of whom received $150. The next grant of $10,000 is going to be spent to purchase books for libraries that have been, or to help in the rebuilding of the library facilities. So you can find a website to donate at Help Ukrainian Books and Booksellers Hub, HUBB, online.
And I hate to ask you to do this in about 2 minutes, but I want to ask, it is so important that so many of these stories are being published, and it sounds like, especially from what you're describing, there's so much effort behind this. But are you also afraid of the memories and experiences that are going to be lost because of this war?
There are so many that already have been lost. There have been so many lives destroyed and upended. And fortunately, on the other side of it, most of Ukraine's writers have refused to leave the country. They've remained there to document them. They are traveling through war zones. They are taking down records. They are writing poems. They are writing essays. They are publishing memoirs about it. I could tell you about one sort of astonishing story of a journalist from Dnipropetrovsk, Stanislava Seyev, who began documenting the war when it really began in 2014. And he was publishing stories about what he saw happening to his neighbors and in his neighborhood under a pseudonym. Somebody revealed his identity. He was arrested and spent several years in torture camps. And he has just published a book called The Torture Camp. It makes for grim reading, but is also a necessary document of the kinds of war crimes that have been committed so widely throughout the country.
I want to thank you so much for sharing that. It's grim, but agree that's so very important. And I want to thank Askold Melnyczuk. He's an English professor at the University of Massachusetts, for sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Catherine. Thank you again, Anne, for your book.
Thank you.
And want to take a moment to thank Anne Howard, is the co-author and translator of Escape from Mariupol, a Survivor's True Story. You can find her book on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Thank you so much, Anne, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.